to sort of talk about Asia, but perhaps excluding Hong Kong, Singapore, and China, where obviously we have an awful lot of focus. But we've gathered a panel here today. Sergio from Gama Asia, looking after this whole big thing that we're going to have a talk about. We've got Kris, who's come over from Airflite in Perth, Australia. We've got Geo from GH Group in Korea. And we've got Jeff to help us through some of the data, go into a bit more detail around these newer, or let's say less exposed regions that we don't talk about quite so often. So I think to start with, we'll start with Sergio, and I think Asia, for you, obviously, Gama's decided to split into the 4 regions across the globe. You've worked in Europe in the past. You know what things go on in different areas. How do you see Asia as a whole? How do you see it compared to maybe Europe and these established markets?
So first of all, it was supposed to be easy questions, yeah. So I don't know what's going on. So anyhow, so the current market, is still a very unique, challenged market. Yeah, it's a huge market. First of all. Secondly, the main difference, if I may summarize in one word, I may use complexity. Complexity to operate in different countries, different authorities, different language, different cultures. Combining with the lack of resources that we have today, facilities, infrastructure, make the region a very, very special region to operate still.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that complexity comes across in all manner of everything that everyone here does. I think with that note then, Jeff, can you perhaps take us through let's focus a bit more on Australia, on Korea and Japan, which Kris and Geo represent, and then perhaps we can have a chat about that once we know a bit more about what we're seeing.
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, as I often do when I'm up here, we always talk about Greater China, but as we all know, the Asia-Pacific region is a big one, and certainly there are many other countries of note. And so part of what I wanted to do, and part of the purpose for the panel, is just to bring some visibility on some of those other areas. And as you can see here, here's the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. Yes, China is the biggest market, but as we know, Australia is second largest, and certainly Korea and Japan, that we will focus on as well, are certainly interesting markets that certainly Asian Sky Group ourselves, we spend quite a lot of time working in, and should also be regions which you focus on too. But just to kind of give you some idea of the, if you will, the scope, size, and some of the peculiarities of these other regions, there's a very quick sort of summary here where, again, you can see the size of the fleets in Australia, Japan, and South Korea. Like I said, Australia is the second largest market. The percentage that they represent, therefore, in the Asia-Pacific region, as far as the fleet, it's Australia being over 15% of that. And again, each one of them, as I said, has their own sort of peculiar characteristics, where you have different aircraft types, different aircraft manufacturers, that for one reason or another, and I think the panel will talk about that, why some manufacturers with certain aircraft types have success and some don't. And we'll talk about the needs of the clients and the requirements mission-wise in those regions as well. But again, you can see top OEMs certainly change. Textron has obviously done very well in all of these 3 markets, but then Bombardier, Gulfstream, Boeing also figuring in as far as the top OEMs. The category of aircraft, light, long range. So again, you get some idea of what other kind of mix of airplanes you see in these regions. Again, if you remember back to China, China is predominantly all long range, large cabin airplanes. Well, in these other regions of the world, actually people are using a different size of airplanes for different things. And again, I think the panel will talk about maturity of markets, because again, when you start talking about Australia, Japan, and South Korea, I think you also have to very much talk about where they are as far as in their development as a business aviation market. And again, I think you see that when you look at the usage of airplanes. A lot of people are maybe critical of the China market, where they don't really buy the aircraft based on what they need. There are other drivers that get them into long-range, large cabin airplanes, where in some of these other markets, as we'll talk about, which are much more mature, yes, people do the right thing maybe, where they actually buy the aircraft as per the mission, as per the needs. Also, as you can see, another interesting point, which I think we'll touch on, is the age of the fleets. And so again, you can see it's almost like a measure of maturity, if you will. You can see Australia by average fleet age is quite old. And again, I think maybe we'll be able to talk about new aircraft purchases versus pre-owned aircraft purchases, what's are preferred in certain regions. And again, a sign of a mature market is they understand the value of a pre-owned aircraft and are more likely to buy that aircraft versus a new because of the value equation. Likewise, looking at registration, for all of these three countries, the predominant registration is actually that incumbent country's registration. And again, when you look at some of the other regions, it's not necessarily so. So again, there are all kinds of different characteristics. And again, finishing at the bottom, looking at the top models, and again, looking where you see now Learjets and CJs and so on and so forth. When we're talking about Greater China, Hong Kong, and China, we're always talking about the big stuff. Well, actually, as I've said, in these other parts of Asia Pacific, lo and behold, actually different size of aircraft are being used, which is good news for the rest of us, because I think it does speak better to the long-term market and the long-term future for the market here in the Asia Pacific region. So, as far as what the individual markets have seen as far as development over the last 5 years, again, Australia continues to be an interesting market. It's experienced growth year on year. Again, it's not double-digit growth, but it's a mature market with a good fleet size. And again, we're seeing growth every year occurring in that market in Australia. And again, here you get some idea of the mix, again, between the different OEMs, which one are predominant, and which aircraft category is the most predominant. Okay. Japan, likewise, not maybe as substantial growth in the last few years, and I think probably talk about that as far as what we might expect to see over the next coming years in Japan. For me, I've had a long history with the Japanese market, and I used to work for Gulfstream, and my boss was a guy by the name of Brian Moss. And if anyone who knows Brian, he was a huge advocate and really saw the future of the Asia market, but he was continually frustrated by Japan and the regulatory environment there. And it's taken a long time, but I think we are starting to see those changes now, and I guess we'll talk on the panel about what some of those may be. Again, the aircraft types, OEM predominantly, and category of aircraft. And last but not least, looking at the South Korean. And again, South Korea is maybe a little wild on the growth rates, again, just because it is a real small fleet. So you lose one airplane and you're 5% change in your growth sort of affair. But again, I think we'll talk about why that fleet isn't more and what the development prospects are for the Korean market as well. So, predominant OEMs, again, looking at the changes over the last 5 years, and also the size category. For me, some of these markets, Australia, Korea, and Japan, are a little bit bipolar. You'll find that they've got a big light fleet, and then they've got up at the corporate airliners and nothing in between. So again, there's some interesting characteristics to each one of these markets, which is, again, the reason for the panel today to talk about them a little bit as well. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think, Kris, one of the biggest messages there is that Australia is the second biggest market outside of China. We've got this place called Australia, and we don't talk about it very often. Why do you think that is?
Probably because it's so far away, but I think one of the major reasons, I promise the food is good and the weather is nice, so you have to visit. But I think one of the reasons is it's predominantly a used market, a pre-owned aviation market. Australian buyers are looking for value, and the reason they buy aircraft is for business purposes, therefore they're seeking returns. It's not about VIP or high net worth comfort or pizzazz, it's specifically about what returns am I getting, what's going to optimise my performance in relation to the demand criteria that is set before me from a business perspective. So therefore, those issues around affordability and returns is what drives that purchasing decision. Therefore, they shop quite frequently on the pre-owned market as opposed to the new market, and that's indicated in the average fleet age. I think also Australia is a mature aviation market, as indicated again by the fleet numbers that we just saw. So in comparison to what we may see in other Southeast Asian and Asian countries where they're developing aviation markets and perhaps more inclined towards the high net worth individual purchases, Australia is a mature market with incremental growth prospects, a pre-owned buyer profile. It's perhaps less exciting than those other emerging markets, despite the fact that it has such a large proportion of the population in Asia and Asia-Pac as a whole. So I think they're the reasons that is really driving that distance between our statistical position and I guess the emotive position we hold in the market in terms of excitement and publicity and attention that it generates through the broader industry.
Okay, great. And then that makeup of light aircraft, you think that's purely down to client selection in terms of this is right for my mission profile, or do you think there's some kind of indicator of the state of Australia in the last few years in cheaper aircraft?
Well, I think you have to consider that Australia as a population has, I think, 25 million people.
I was going to say, is it a geography thing as well?
Well, I think our geography, I live in Perth personally, which is on the west coast of Australia, so for me to get anywhere, I probably need something a little bit larger. But that said, the percentage of high net worth individuals that can afford the type of platform that's going to be able to take them long distances is less likely, leading you therefore back to that light jet area, even for the high net worth section of our population, added to the fact that the majority of our business jet buyers are going to be those operationally driven, business driven individuals buying for a specific business purpose. An operational purpose, you're not going to buy something twice the size and twice the range if you can pay half the price and get exactly what you want. So you can see how that starts to influence the statistics that we see in front of us.
So a lot more sort of kind of maybe rational decision making than that kind of
exactly
thing.
Yeah, I'd like to assume that Australians are rational, so hopefully those of you who have bumped into Australians at the pub don't draw that a conclusion based on that, but yeah, Australians predominantly in business are very rational decision makers. Yeah.
Okay. So, Geo, maybe we can move over to a similar sort of question and for Japan and Korea. Maybe not quite the same distances, scales, sizes involved, but when you talk about sort of the financial power of Japan, you may assume that these markets would be bigger than they're being shown now. What do you think of that? Is there any particular reason? Or?
If we're talking about two countries, Japan, especially for Japan and Korea, they are pretty much a similar situation in terms of financial development, financial and economic development. Japan is a little far than Korea, but the purchase capability of both countries will be somehow similar because majority of capable buyers in those two countries will be corporate public companies. But the problem in those two countries will couple of problems I can see. This is my personal opinion, but based on my experience. But the first thing will be public. Still, cultural differences, huge cultural differences exist, because using business jet or private jet in Western countries is quite common concept. But in Korea and Japan, if we're talking about business aviation, very little knowledge and very less exposures than Western countries. There's a reason why if we're talking about the business aviation business in those countries, the publics will have less understanding, and they just don't understand why they need the business jets for what. They just think, as mentioned earlier in this morning session, in the sessions in the morning, it is not seen as business tools, just like wealthy people's kind of in the leisure things. But in reality, in Korea and Japan, it is purely used for Japan and the global business expansion. But that's the reason why in those two countries there are limited number of people, the potential buyers who can have purchase power.
So do you think it's therefore maybe political reasons or economic reasons that over the last, I think we saw from Jeff, it's sort of flat in Korea over the last 5 years, Japan is flat over the last 3 years.
Yes.
that's got something to do with it? Or?
Yes, public perception is one of the biggest problem, but apart from that, we have another two problems. Government support, very lack of government support. For example, if we are the big corporate owners who are considering to get the new jet, they need to have they need to justify a huge long list of reasons why they need another jet. That's the reason why the governments in both countries are not supportive for jet owners, especially for corporate jet owners. But public companies in Korea and Japan, they purely need their business jets for global expansion. So in Korea, we had lots of the political scandals in past 5 years. There was if I'm talking about the Korea, the biggest current problems of Korea will be the public scandal, what happened in past 5 years. Because of that, couple of big public companies, the presidents of public companies has been jailed, involved in bribing with the ex-president. That's the reason why public started to think public companies will use business jets for something bad like this. They just have some anticipation of anti-laundering things that actually was not happened. It was part of bribing things. In Japan, same. They also have the less support from government, getting license, and another problem is the lack of number of airports, regional airports. They still don't have FBO facilities, so it's very hard to operate the business aviation operation in Japan.
So maybe it's not surprising, maybe it is, I'm not sure, but we're hearing very similar themes across everywhere. Infrastructure, investment, economic, political climates, those kind of things are all having a big impact.
Well, if I can, I'll just build on what Geo was saying and add the Australian position to that. You spoke about the justification of business jets and how that's perceived. In Australia, we're seeing a trend towards what we call a triple bottom line reporting for major organisations, where it's economic and it's social and it's environmental. And they're under pressure there, not just to show that we've made a 12% return on capital, but also that you're doing things in the right way and you're caring for the environment and you're caring for the society. So that public pressure to do things the right way, how you justify the use of private aviation and business jet solutions in that context becomes important, because it's not about whether the board of directors agrees that that is a good decision or will add efficiency to their operations or improve their capacity to reach new markets and manage their existing business. It's about convincing mum and dad shareholder that having that shiny, flash new business jet and flying in that way is beneficial to their return on capital in the end. And this is one of the challenges, albeit for somewhat different reasons, but the management of perception is resonated with me and sounds like it's similar across both cultures, albeit for different reasons.
Okay, great. I think
but I was going to say, I think the difference though is you have a government in Australia that isn't against business aviation. Right?
That's correct.
I mean, they're supportive and they're a big user of business aviation themselves. Whereas I think in Korea and Japan, that's another, I mean, a lot of the public perception issues come from the fact that the government's not supporting it either. So, right?
Yeah, so the Australian government, to give an example, just bought 3 new Falcon jets for their own VIP fleet under the Australian Air Force 34 Squadron. There are no tax incentives for private jet ownership in Australia, so in that way they're not encouraging it, but they're certainly not discouraging it. So that then brings into focus then the difference and the contrast, as you pointed out, with Korea.
Oh. One of the things that Jeff pointed out, I think one of the startling sort of things on there from Australia was the fleet age, the average fleet age, 20.2 years, I think it was. I don't think we're necessarily saying that everyone bought a jet 20 years ago and now it's 20 years old, basically. Having said that, I think sort of especially in Perth, where you're from, sort of the macroeconomic climate of Australia has changed, I'd say, considerably over the last 20 years or so. Does that present an opportunity? Is that something that we can look forward to in the future? Or?
Look, I think it does in some ways. The Australian economy was traditionally driven by agriculture, so that created opportunities in the smaller end of general aviation. GDP over the last 20 years has, I think, tripled. It's dropped off in the last 3 or 4 years, and that change in the economic size of Australia has been driven by the resources sector, mining and oil and gas predominantly. That generates opportunities most directly in things like regional airlines, rotary wing charter, direct business charter. It doesn't necessarily equate directly to business aviation. However, there is a flow-on effect with economic growth that you would anticipate there are opportunities there. In relation to the age of the fleet, a 20-year-old fleet, it's natural that over time there's going to be replacements of aircraft. Bearing in mind the psychology and the profile of the Australian buyer, as I said before though, that's going to be leaning towards a pre-owned market. As it leans towards that pre-owned market, it may be creating opportunities for new aircraft sales elsewhere. In relation to aircraft management, any time that someone is looking at making a change in their fleet or the profile of their aviation department represents an opportunity to reconsider what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what best achieves those aims. So regardless of whether they're replacing that 20-year-old aircraft with a 5-year-old aircraft or a brand new aircraft, for organisations like Gama and others, there's an opportunity there to have conversations around what is it you're trying to achieve with your aviation solutions and how can we help you achieve that. So there certainly are opportunities within that, but within the confines and the understanding of what the Australian buyer and the Australian typical profile looks like.
I mean, if I may, you talked about rotary, and I know we're corporate jet investor here, but when you look at the Asia-Pacific fleet of piston and turbine helicopters, I mean, Australia is just huge. It's the biggest market, particularly if you look at the pistons. I mean, it's like 2,000 of them in Australia, and 1,000 of them are operated by single aircraft owners. I mean, it's just a huge, huge fleet. But again, it goes back to, I think, that Australian mentality that the equipment that they're buying is very functional, and it's purpose-driven, and they need it to do a task. And again, a lot of that is driven by, I also need to do that task and do it in an economical way, and that drives the pre-owned.
Correct, yeah, and those helicopters, just to touch on it briefly, they're predominantly in the agriculture space or the hobby space.
What used to be done on horseback is now done by a Robinson 22.
Yeah, they don't need as much hay, but yeah, they're still expensive to operate. So yeah, that's predominantly the helicopter market. The other end of the helicopter market is the oil and gas charter and RPT services that exist out to remote sites or rigs offshore. So yeah.
That actually links quite nicely, because the second thing that we were going to look at once we've looked at sort of where we are today, which I think you've all explained really nicely, is where's the opportunity there? What do we need to do to sort of, if the market is so different, we have turboprops, we have helicopters, do we have to look at different ways in which we're selling? So I think, Sergio, Gama's just announced that it's going to sort of try and move away from the big three, kind of, well, not move away, but slightly diversify, let's say. Why was that? How did you come up with that sort of method of sales to sort of go over there?
As you just mentioned, and we also mentioned before, I think the last 24 hours I heard the word China 10,000 times in this conference. So we need to try to go to the different markets somehow, somewhere. We know this is a very challenging job to do, to go to a new market. We also know that we are very happy with the parts that we found, from GH to Airflite in Australia. So yes, we're going to bring some fun to those markets. We're going to give some fun to competition. We're going to give some new product service to the clients in the region. So we're very, very happy what's going to happen there, and looking forward for that, to be honest.
Okay, great. So Geo, then in that case, so what do you think is going to happen in Korea and Japan in the next 5-10 years or so?
I think it's positive because Korea, we have a new FBO, which was operated a couple of years ago. It's almost 4 years now, and we had Winter Olympic season. It was quite successful through FBO. Aviation operation was not really bad compared to the past. What it means, the business aviation growth is anticipated in Korea with the new facility. Government still restricted, but the government support is improved. And one of our public companies considering to have a new long-range fleets very soon. So that will make some boom for other corporate, the other potential corporate jet owners who can consider to have new jets in the future. So I think the business aviation growth, the possibility of business aviation growth in Korea will be positive. Japan, same, they already have a long-range business jets, and it's good market to start, but they were a little calm for past 3 years. But probably because of their hierarchy things, the tough decision-making process, government involvement in terms of their license operation or license issuance. So but they must focus. Lots of the companies in Japan, they are still focusing on global expansion. So there will be a need for future market, and also big events, as everybody know, big events like Olympic in 2012, 2020, and it will come up, and Para-Olympics as well. So there's a big demand, I think, for business aviation operators for Japan.
Okay, great. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if I had to put my money, I'd put my money on Japan before I put it on Korea. I think a big issue in Korea, as you mentioned already, is just with the past unfortunate scandals that we've had in Korea, the public environment is just not very conducive to there being big changes in how Korea perceives business aviation. Whereas I think in Japan, the environment is getting better. I think JCAB finally is making the changes regulatory-wise to make it certainly easier. And I think also that certainly we've got the Olympics coming up, as you mentioned, and so on. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to have more visibility for business aviation as well. You know, you've got some first-time aircraft types going in Japan now. I know we have an ACJ 318 now in Japan that's based there, and so again, aircraft types are coming into that market, and they're getting more exposure. So I think that bodes well for the future as well. So, and again, the last thing, we're seeing a lot more activity from the Japanese banks as well. I mean, they are getting more interested back in financing private aircraft, and whether or not that has I don't know, one for all for one effect where you're going to see more activity domestically as well, I don't know. But we're certainly seeing a lot more activity from the Japanese banks as well. So whether that, again, just makes the whole environment better in Japan and leads to a better future down the road, I guess we'll wait and see.
Fantastic. So you mentioned the Olympics. Funnily enough, it's 20 years on from the Sydney Olympics. So how does that tie in? What's the same question, I guess, for Australia? What do you think is going to be in the future?
Look, I think Australia's got some interesting times ahead. You mentioned the banking sector in Japan. In Australia, we've just come out of the back of a banking inquiry, Royal Commission, and that highlighted that the banks need to act differently and behave with integrity. Whether that shifts their risk profile in relation to obviously a whole host of business areas, but in particularly mobile and specialised assets like aircraft, it could be interesting to see what type of effect that has. The Australian government, the Reserve Bank of Australia 2 weeks ago cut the official interest rate to an all-time low. What that'll do in terms of devaluing the Australian currency, assuming obviously everything else remains equal. And the impact that has on the Australian consumer, its capacity to buy aircraft in obviously foreign currency like US dollars, is also potentially going to have an impact in that medium term. I think Australia is stable economically, but it has some interesting moments and trigger points ahead. That interest rate is indicative that there's an economy that needs a bit of stimulus. We also have increased housing prices that need to be controlled. So we have a series of economic factors that from a macroeconomic perspective could have an impact on the affordability within the market for high-end aviation solutions, or the perception of doing that. If you're an organisation that has gone and cut 1,000 employees, should you then be flying in your private jet to announce the redundancies? So you can see there'll be some potential economic challenges there, but Australia by and large has been fairly steady. I expect that incremental gradual growth to continue, and those big issues, they'll occur when they occur, or they'll be managed before they occur, hopefully, and we'll see what comes of the market as a result. But I would expect but for any large crisis being triggered, that we should have steady incremental growth continue.
So positive and replacing some of those ageing aircraft then, basically?
I think so, because we have, in terms of ageing aircraft fleet, you have, one, a very safety conscious society in Australia. Second, anything that's used for operational reasons, there's strong union power in Australia. So quite often there'll be fleet revisions will be pursued, at least in the airline market, and it may filter down into the business aviation market, that we do not want to fly in something that is older than 25 years old, as an example, and those are things that have been communicated to airline clients. So if that same mentality of safety consciousness, of preservation, of ensuring that you're looking after your people and yourself, as the case may be, could lead itself to a greater rate of fleet replacement as that average age continues to increase. And obviously at that average you're going to have some well below and you're going to have some well over, so there's going to be opportunities there.
Super.
And just a point, I mean, the fleet data that I show is turbine, fixed wing. And again, if you want to look at the Australian market, to do it justice, I say piston, but you also need to look at turboprops. I mean, it's got to be the biggest market I think of all of Asia Pacific for King Airs, for instance. And so again, going back to that typical Aussie mindset, you know, that type of do everything type of airplane like a King Air that it is, I mean, very, very popular, huge fleet down there.
What we'll do then, we'll add those in next time.
Yeah, next time.
Year, okay. I've got one more question, but Al, I don't know if there's anything coming up on Slido or any questions from the audience for the panel. No? Okay, no worries. Hopefully we've kept you all awake, but we're just getting it. So I think as a summary, yesterday there was a question that came up: how positive are we all feeling about our own businesses going into the rest of this year? I want to slightly rephrase that based on what we've been talking about today. Let's say, excluding Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, as we've been doing here, what's your feeling about the rest of the Asia-Pac market over the coming years? Maybe we'll start with Jeff and walk down.
Which ones am I eliminating?
Hong Kong, China, and Singapore.
I mean, I think everyone in the room would agree that the rest of Southeast Asia is performing very well. And again, if you look at the numbers that are in our report, I mean, likewise, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, I mean, they all had good between 5 and 10% growth. And for me, so those are where the real opportunities are at the moment, Southeast Asia. I mean, as you pointed out, and you're absolutely correct, I think Australia will always be a steady comer every year. I don't see we're going to be any big slip back in the Australian market. It just keeps marching on to a certain degree. But where you see the real, if you will, higher single-digit, maybe low double-digit type of growth opportunities, it's in Southeast Asia at the moment.
Okay, Geo. Same question. What do you think? What do you think of the whole region over the coming years?
Korea and Japan.
Anywhere, Korea and Japan, or everywhere?
Yep, I think it's still growing because I know somehow it's tough to educate the public to overcome lots of barriers in Asia-Pacific region compared to Western countries, but the difficulty means another chance we can touch. So if we're talking about Korea and Japan, quite immature market, there's opportunities exist to educate them. Of course, taking a lot of time to get the outcomes, but we can try. It is quite rare to try.
So the difficulty will provide an opportunity, I think. That's good. Kris, we're coming to you, and we've got a question up. When an Australian owner upgrades his 20-year-old aircraft, do they simply buy a younger aircraft in the same category, or do they go up in category?
Look, that depends on the individual customer requirements. We've had examples of both. The most recent client of ours was an upgrade in size, and that was to meet the growing needs and their growing use of aviation as a solution for them and their business. So as they enter the market, they get comfortable with it, they see that it adds value, they then look at doing that differently. But we've also had customers that are simply swapping out, essentially, for more of the same. So again, it really depends on the customer situation and the customer profile, but both are very much in play in the Australian market.
And you're positive about it all going forward as well, yeah?
I am. I think Australia and New Zealand is going to be very stable. There's no doubt about that. I think Indonesia is a market that Airflite's very much involved in. You've got a population of 260 plus million people. You've got a very relatively small business aviation market. You've got a growing economy that's going to become the 4th largest in the world. There's immense potential there, we think, for business aviation growth, as there are in countries like Thailand and Malaysia. So from a Southeast Asian perspective, there is growth in that market, and they're looking for expertise, they're looking for people they can trust, they're looking for people with proven track records, and I think the people in this room and organisations like us sitting up here are well positioned to be able to provide that.
Perfect, thank you. Sergio, I guess you agree?
Yes, I'm Portuguese, I'm always positive, yeah? So easy as that. No, if before this panel I was positive, after I heard your guys' feedback and your insights about the market and the future, I think I'm even more positive today. So looking forward for that. Yeah, it'll be a fun ride for sure. Thank you.
Super. Well, that's it. Time's up. So thank you very much, everybody, for speaking. That was very informative. I hope it was. We managed to keep you awake in the graveyard session. So thank you very much.
thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. And it's always nice to step away from the number of times we mentioned China at this conference and look at some of the other markets. We're now going to go to the future. Delighted to have a mixed panel of James Hardy from Collins Aerospace, Mike Walsh, who needs no introduction to many of the people in the late night bars of Singapore. Sorry, who needs no introduction to this audience, Mike Walsh from Aero Mobi, and also Nadav Kessler from Asian Sky Group. And Nadav's partly here in his, Nadav believes that business jets are too simple and that only rotary assets are worth looking at. Great. So there's a lot of talk going on about now being the most exciting period since the jet age. This is the start of a fourth industrial revolution. James, do you agree?
I tend to sort of think that revolution is maybe too strong. It's there's so much that's just evolving. It's and maybe it looks a bit like a revolution because there's so much communication about things. But what's really happening is probably just more evolving.
Really? So things like 3D printing, you know, or additive manufacturing at the atomic level is now possible. AI. You don't see this as the start of a new...
No, I don't really, because I think that...
okay, well, thanks so much. That was a great panel.
I think these are...
Sorry you guys didn't get a chance to speak. But
these are great new technologies to be embraced and to find out what they can do for things, but I think it's just another evolution of what we're...
I'll just say I think we are going through some sort of a revolution. Whether or not it's hitting business aviation, I don't think so yet. I think it's mostly in applications that are exterior to business aviation as we see it at the moment, and maybe it'll evolve separately.
You see, I agree with you, and I think that's also, rather than James, not for the first time. And I think that's, I think there's so much going on in automotive technology that will end up in aviation, or is already starting to. Mike?
I have to say, I agree with James. It's not a revolution in business aviation per se, but there are changes happening which I hope will come into business aviation eventually. I think it's pockets of major breakthroughs happening, but they haven't come to market yet in our sector.
So is that because business aviation, although the products, the aircraft are constantly evolving, constantly being technologically advanced, is that because this is an industry that's slow to adopt new technology?
I think the OEMs adopt new technology. In fact, they probably lead in technology in the cockpit and certain areas of the cabin as well, and aerodynamics, composite materials, all of that. But where I see the revolution of the new technology that could really make a difference is in the operational front of making it more efficient for the end client experience of using those jets and equipment.
I think aviation has always been in the forefront of technology. Whether or not the pace of change right now of technology outside of aviation is too fast for business aviation or general aviation to keep up with is, to me, what's you know, the holdback. If business aviation, obviously with all the safety and regulatory difficulties, needs to evolve in a different pace, I think other technologies are advancing faster, or too fast for business aviation.
Well, I think that aviation has faced a number of challenges in terms of regulation, and I was speaking with in the UK government a green paper recently, and it's great to see in their sort of vision of 2050 future aviation strategy that they recognise that they probably need to have a lighter touch when it comes to regulation and especially with new technologies to allow adoption. That when you hide behind some of the things and call it's because of safety, but it's not necessarily inherently unsafe. And I think that there's a great opportunity in this region, perhaps in particular, because of you know, the emerging of this industry, to take on new things, to be the very best. Whereas perhaps in the US and in Europe, some things in the US and Europe are just a lot easier to do. So, but that might make people a little bit lazy and sort of leave them behind. So the best operators will be pushing to find little marginal gains in all aspects of their business and not sitting on their laurels. So embrace the technology, figure out which bits are going to work for you, and keep pressing ahead.
Mike, any comments on regulators in the region?
I think, surprisingly, they're actually very open to now listening to our sector. I think there's people in the room that I know very well. 8 years ago, we walked into the Hong Kong CAD and we literally got thrown out in the first meeting when we asked about, slots and parking. Actually, parking was the issue at that point in Hong Kong. But now, I would say there's an open door policy, and it's actually up to us to go and make the effort to meet with them on a regular basis and keep educating them about what our needs are. And we were talking about this offline, but we hope that there will be a light touch on regulation and more self-regulating, if you like, but we have to sort of prove to them that we're capable of self-regulation in how we adopt this new technologies.
Yeah, just touching on Asia specifically, maybe it's an advantage in some way that infrastructure and regulations are not as mature as other places in the world. So for them to adapt to new technology and a revolution may be actually easier. The infrastructure is not in place right now for other older technologies, so why not just skip it and be more open to new development?
Do you think, so we run a conference called Revolution.aero in San Francisco and London, and we have hundreds of, there's 110 startup companies trying to launch VTOL, electric aircraft or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. I always think the landing's redundant. You should just assume that it would do that before you get in it. But do you think that the people who are coming into this industry to disrupt it understand how hard it is to meet regulators' requests?
I think they don't understand, but they're learning on the hard way. And eventually, if they're persistent enough, they're going to have to learn and maybe borrow some knowledge and expertise from real people who are in business aviation at the moment. And it'll be a process, but eventually adjust to what's needed.
Okay, so we have this diagram of some of the new technologies that are coming and being worked on. James, which one of those do you think is the most overhyped?
Urban air mobility. I think that the challenge of why a lot of the reason why you might want to do urban air mobility is to do with land mobility having some problems. But if you can solve the problem of urban air mobility, I think you'd almost immediately solve the problem of congestion in cities with just better management and taking human sort of error out of that decision loop. So I think that the mobility part of it is interesting, and it might be that it's actually more about connecting rural areas and changing the way that the infrastructure works in countries, and the opportunity for spreading the load away from the urban centres.
Mike, do you agree?
I disagree. So it's already happening, urban air mobility, but the first adoption is always going to be cargo because it doesn't involve people. And it's already happening here in Asia. Actually, Asia is the fastest growing adoption of urban air mobility ahead of America, despite we only hear that it comes out of Long Beach and places like that. But so I'll give you a few examples. So EHang announced at A-Base that they'd done 30,000 test flights to 6,000 clients around the Guangzhou area with CAC's knowledge.
It would have been a brave announcement without to say we've just done this
exactly
quietly.
In China, yeah. And just on the 29th of May, they did their first commercial flight with DHL China from Guangzhou. So it's already happening. And then you've got JD.com, the arch rival of Alibaba, who've just done their first overseas test flight in Indonesia earlier this year, also with cargo under 5 kilo payload, home parcel delivery services. So you're going to see that, I think, more and more. And it comes back to Nadav's part, where there's this sort of lack of education or knowledge or historic issues that you may face in the West of regulation. It doesn't exist, so they're just skipping and going straight, okay, what do we need to do to make this work for the OEM that's bringing it to market? And they're bringing it to market, so I disagree.
I don't know. Well, I'm just taking a guess.
No, I think what Mike said is true, but I do agree that it's overhyped. And I think it's the last question, but I think it is going to take a while until it's a reality. So yes, as a first stage, maybe some light cargo, but if later on, if you want to envision a situation where you have cargo air vehicles of some sort flying around, plus urban mobility of human beings inside a city, it's going to be one big beehive.
Can I just comment, how light is light cargo?
It could be anything from a 1 foot box to...
Because there's already been a 1 ton piece tested by JD.com in the north of China under a drone.
Yeah, no doubt that it can lift. I mean, the equipment is there to lift equipment. Whether or not the airspace will be open enough to enable real mass movement, I don't know.
As someone who has dedicated a lot of your professional life to helicopters, does it upset you that you've got all these people saying how helicopters are rubbish and the future is all drone?
Not at all.
Okay, if we could go back to the slide for a minute. 88% of the people here. Nadav, would you like to pick? Is there anything on there that excites you?
No, I'm kidding. Maybe, not excites me, but I think the most relevant or most important point right now is actually the Internet of Aircraft. Maybe that's where we'll see the biggest change as a first stage of revolution.
James?
I think that
you agree with the Internet of Aircraft, don't you?
No, well, I like that one too, but I like the autonomy one. I think that's going to, and whether it's autonomy or semi-autonomy, and the ability to improve the sort of human and machine interface and that relationship will be. I think that will be incredibly empowering and enabling for lots of different things. And I think that would also, I know there's lots of efforts to try and solve the very difficult problems, which is great. And but some of the other problems, humans are really good at some things, and computers are not so good at them yet. But there are some great opportunities there. I mean, there's talk of the trough of pilots, a demographic trough of not enough pilots in the world. Technology could probably alleviate that to a great degree, but you would also need to have, an acceptance that it was okay for an aircraft to be operated by a single pilot with assistance from maybe some sort of ground infrastructure and a connected support system, but as well as the equipment on board the aircraft that supports autonomy or semi-autonomy.
I think they're both very, very related, by the way. Those two specifically are very connected.
So I'll pick just selfishly, because I think from a perceptual point of view, our industry is seen as a high polluter. So I'm going for the electrification and alternative energy. So I don't know if you're aware, but back in January, there was the first demonstration of the aviation sustainable fuel usage in Van Nuys. And the second demonstration was commenced out of Farnborough Tag Airport just before E-Base, where 27 aircraft uplifted at 4 different airports and flew into Geneva with aviation sustainable fuel composite in their tanks. So I would say it's a key issue for our industry to keep driving that in order to meet the CO2 emissions targets, which are in the early 2020s. So for me, it's continuing along that path, and I'd love to see that third demonstration come to be in Asia somehow, maybe in 2020, with people's support from the fuel companies. Thank you.
And I think that's probably a big weak point in the industry, is the environmental. Actually, you can get it. It's one of the few places you can get sustainable jet fuel is New Zealand, so it's coming here. We've got a question actually it's a comment, I think. For your information, a Singapore GLC is targeting pilot-less cargo airliners with a working proof of concept vehicle already established. So that's someone else commenting on the future. Do you think business aviation will be the last aviation industry to lose pilots, though?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so, yeah, just because of the nature of who's in the back.
I'm not sure we'll lose them so quickly. The role and the responsibilities might change a little bit, and they already have in the way that pilots operate the aircraft, and whether or not they have to be good handling pilots, or are they system management?
I always like questions like this, because I think when people look at the future, you can usually tell when people are planning to retire. And that's when they see the big change. Mike, I should have given you a chance to explain Airmobi. Do you want to take us through what your new company is doing?
Well, basically, it's just going more into the advisory side of house, of getting out of the operational side of aircraft management per se, but helping companies who wish to enter Asia or expand their footprint in Asia, both in an aerospace area, whether it's traditional or the future. So helping companies perhaps like Volocopter, Terrafugia, who are trying to bring product to market but don't yet have that government relations either. So I really see the use of my 12 years here and experience to be able to shortcut that bridge in making the relationships and educating to bring the product to market. Thank you.
Crystal balls, basically.
Crystal balls, thank you.
James, do you think there's a lot of hype? You can say that there's links to the VLJ or similarities to the very light jet boom. Do you think business aviation companies will, the light jet? Well, there was a boom because you had a bust, so you had to have had a boom. Do you see business aviation companies leading the way with new technology, or staying off in their existing business?
Okay. I think that business aviation will expand its kind of mode of operation into a wider range of point-to-point transportation. I think that there could be the increased democratization of access to it will be helpful. There's certainly plenty of lift capacity at the moment, but is it accessible and easily accessible for people that have not used it before? Those things are potentially changing at the moment, and then as that does happen, if that does happen, then we should see certain other things start to reduce the cost of accessing it, perhaps, and or its accessibility in all sorts of other different ways, whether it's the cost of the aircraft to manufacture them, or what problems they're actually solving. Can we manufacture aircraft that are specific mission profiles for a smaller area, rather than trying a sort of one size fits all?
I'm just looking at the question on the screen and getting distracted there because it's pointed directly at me, but maybe I can switch tack just to answer the question that's on Slido very quickly, because I think James has answered that other question. The one-ton scenario, by the way, that's obviously in a controlled environment, but test center, but the idea is for that sort of payload, it would be they would be able to keep it away from highly populated areas, because they don't necessarily have to go point to point, and they can be going around and to a distribution center, whatever it is. So I don't think it's a like for like. It's the lower payload for the home delivery, little parcels under 5 kilos typically. But
that's still going to sting, isn't it? If one of those falls on you as you're walking along, How do you, so one of the interesting things is the UK set up an air accident investigations branch in 1912, and it only set up a rail one in 2010. People don't like things flying over them. Do you see, the US intercity helicopter market was pretty much shut down by one helicopter, crashing on top of a building in Chicago, a long time ago.
Yeah, but one happened a few days ago and nothing. I mean, New York's still flying. It happens frequently.
So you don't see this as a big concern?
I think it's a huge concern, but I think as time goes by, they'll also find ways to cope with the risks of autonomous aircraft lifting equipment or transporting people.
I mean, most of these systems have redundancies, otherwise they're not going to be allowed to be certified. So I think the minimum is 2 or 3 redundancy systems have to be in place for it to be certified according to China regulation. But there's also been that question, well, not sorry, I won't go into that, but it's, I mean, you could be walking along the street and a loose window falls on your head from a skyscraper in Hong Kong because it wasn't well maintained. But so I don't know, I mean, safety is paramount in the industry, and I think that will continue, but we shouldn't stop innovation just because of fear of something happening.
I think it's interesting when you go to a proof of concept and what that concept is that you're trying to prove that you can do, but what it actually results in could be completely different. And I think we do need to remain open-minded about where some of these solutions or technological solutions could take us, and what future problems they might solve, or how they might change the world in a different way to what we can conceive of right now.
Okay. How can, I think there's more focus on aviation now. There's far more investment in early stage startup companies. We have all the new technologies coming in. So, how can people pick which are going to be the winners?
I mean, there's a few leading contenders already, right? I mean, all the major manufacturers are in this space already. That's how serious they're taking it. So you've got Embraer X. They just announced their Beacon platform. Their first customer is Jet Suite X, which is funded by Qatar Airways. They're very keen to grow that network of all different facets of the urban air mobility as a platform under Embraer X's knowledge and experience. Plus you've got Boeing next, you've got A3 Airbus, you've got Lithium, Volocopter I've mentioned earlier. So most of the manufacturers are involved, and that also spills down to the supply chain of Rolls-Royce engine. The engine development changes, it becomes a different concept to power these things, which I'm sure Rolls-Royce is looking at this as well, and others. So it does mean, I think it's a new area for entire business aviation supply chain to be looking at, and if they're not, they're going to be maybe behind the curve.
I think these are all the OEMs, these are manufacturers, which is important, but the ones who will win are the ones who can make the operation work, because that's to me where the big challenge is actually. Technology is great, but whether or not we can make it work as in the macro operational sphere, that's a big question.
But can I just come back on that? Because there is regulation committees set up in America at RPAS, remote aerial aircraft systems, which is set up in the US. It has FAA on its panel, it has IBAC on its panel. So they're actually forming the regulation in order to make it easier to operate these autonomous vehicles in America, and I think whatever comes out of these will start to be adopted as international standards under ICAO.
James, you work for a big aerospace company. Are you backing the big aerospace companies to win?
I don't know what you mean by that question. There's so many things that people are, when you're trying to solve problems, though, it's like, well, what problem are you actually trying to solve? And that becomes part of normal business planning, which we obviously do. We do all this. We have an advanced technology center. They're looking at things for the future. They do experimental stuff. I mean, it's quite interesting, and the ideas that are there. But ultimately, the market will decide whether you solved a problem either for very many people at a relatively low cost, in which case you're going to make some money, or if you just solved a problem for a few people who are then going to have to pay, you know, really value it and pay an awful lot for it. So business aviation currently solves a transportation problem. It was originally more about time saving and direct access to, you know, to get to places that weren't necessarily well served by commercial airlines. It was born in the USA because of the way the aerospace structure was there, and it did solve a problem. As other technologies have come in and changed it, the actual travel dynamic has changed as well. So how people are using business aviation, whether or not it needs to be, you know, is speed the main problem to solve when you've got such a nice environment to be in for a period of time that it would be, you know, difficult to see that it was any worse than any office. So that changes things a little bit. You know, figure out what problem it is that you're actually trying to solve, and whether or not technology is necessary. Some things are just science experiments to figure out, you know, can we do this? And the result will be different. I don't know if I answered your question.
I'm not sure what question you answered. If you even did answer a question.
I think you...
So do you think it's...
I was trying to answer it as me rather than as a representative of...
Rockwell Collins.
Yeah.
Sorry, Collins Aerospace. Sorry, Raytheon. I lose track. Okay, how quickly will we see changes?
Well, I just mentioned, I think we're already seeing the changes. We're just not aware of them unless you read about it. So I'm thinking it's going to continue. You're going to see more launches of new products, such as air taxi services. I think Max touched about it yesterday, that there's a new air taxi service, or earlier today, I should say, in Manila. And there's already one in Indonesia. So helicopters will be the first adoption for passenger, because that does still have pilots and it's regulated and safety, despite there still crashes happen. But cargo, from autonomy point of view, will be the first adoption over the next 10 years. That will be, I think, the technology is there, operations is there. I think for passenger side, it's more of a psychological thing. I'm not sure I'd want to go up in one of those without a pilot in it, regardless of all the fail-safes, because I'm scared of heights.
At our London conference, we had a VTOL manufacturer going, the problem is the pilots weigh a lot. So that actually, economically, so he was going, now is a great time to be a retired jockey. Nada?
I think it's going to take time. I think it's beyond the 10 years before we see real change in the usage of air mobility, for example. 15 plus.
15 plus years.
I mean, it's changing all the time, of course, but until we really see autonomous vehicles flying around freely, I think we're quite far away.
Well, I think if you look at some of the, if you were to look at established markets where people are trying to get things changed, and then say, well, we're not as an established market, but maybe we can get in front of our regulators and government and encourage an earlier adoption rate, there might be a chance to kind of leapfrog ahead of even the established areas.
Question from Paul Jebley. just for the record, Paul Jebley's rate of approved questions that make it through is very low. Nadav, in a society where pizza gets to your house before the police, why would you ever order pizza at the same time as calling the police to prove this? Is there a market for law enforcement for these mobile platforms?
It already is. Law enforcement are using them all the time. It's like the first market, actually.
Okay.
Thanks.
And also medical. I think medical is a big sector that these autonomous vehicles will be an enabler to these remote regions, easier to get to.
Okay. So in The Graduate, the film The Graduate, there's the famous scene where not that famous scene, where they recommend, rubbers or plastics or chemicals as the future business. Which is the future technology that you would be betting on to change business aviation first?
Hydrogen-powered battery technology.
I was going to say power technology. I don't know which, but yes, I think that's the game changer.
Battery or
energy? Yep. And maybe, I don't know, connectivity of the platform somehow in the air, which will be linked to airspace. I mean, I can't answer that actually.
I don't know, but I'm still going to bet on people, because in business aviation, I think that is going to be important. And even with all these technologies and the threats from the sort of perceived threats, people working with people more effectively.
Okay. Finally, what year, I don't need day or month, just what year, will people be leaving this conference in an urban VTOL?
When I've persuaded property owners who own these kind of hotels to change their rooftops to enable them to land on it.
So what year is that?
When do I retire? 2032.
Doesn't matter. 2032.
2032?
I have no idea, but I think it's a lot further off at the moment than that. I don't think it's 15 years away. And if it is, it will be. I think it'll still be fewer.
Uber, which is its conference in Washington today, is still saying 2023 for Dallas.